Hey, what's up, guys? Nick Quintero here, and today I'm going to show you how I made the artwork for my new podcast with my friend Fabian Rodello, where we talk about movies. All right, let's go. All right, so the podcast is called Feature Film Club, and we chose the name because Fight Club was one of our favorite movies when we first started hanging out. And even though the Fight Club soap style logo is kind of played out, I still thought it would be appropriate for this project. So that's what I'm doing. So I took this screenshot from some random website. I mean, it was probably like a wallpaper or something. So I started with the text or the type tool to try to get the Fight Club font that I downloaded from DaFont working here. But it had some weird characters. Like I really hated the C that was in this. I don't even remember the name of this font. I'm sorry. But yeah, it's just really ugly. They tried to make it too much like the G, but flipped around. And it just really didn't work out. So I decided to take a screenshot of this soap, go over to Illustrator, and play with my text there. So same process, type out the words here and use this DaFont font and try to make it look good. So play with some kerning here. And I decided to type out the O so I could just turn that into the C. I figured it would be much easier than messing around with what they already had as a C and trying to repair that. I mean, that was just super fast. So now I decided to zoom in and really just kind of start tweaking so that it looked closer to that original Fight Club logo. I'm really not even sure if this soap that I found has the real like original one, but it's close enough. So the first thing I did was shrink the top words and try to make them fit and stack all the way up so that, you know, it was this stacked lettering like the original logo. And so I made feature the same width as film, and I made sure that they were all touching. I tried it several different ways, but it just, I don't know. I didn't love it stacked like this. Yeah, I don't know what was wrong with this B here, but I pulled that little part there so that it connected with the U, which is exactly what it did in that reference. And then I just smoothed out this weird B. I don't understand the choices that they made here. So yeah, the stacked logo just, you know, really wasn't doing it for me. I mean, the way that film was so much smaller than club and feature was so much smaller than that, I just wasn't loving it. So I decided to shrink down the word film to match the size of feature and just create it in 2 lines, despite the fact that it was going to be a lot smaller on the top. I thought it just looked so much better and a lot more natural. So that's what I stuck with. I am really glad that I did this in Illustrator because now I have like a vector version of the logo that I can use for other things if we ever decide to make some t-shirts or something for ourselves. This will be a great place to start. We won't have to mess around with the photoreal imagery that I ended up with. All right, so let's go back into Photoshop and I'm going to paste this in as a smart object, or actually I think I just did pixels so I can mess with it some more. And I tried to line it up as close as I could to the original Fight Club logo that was on there. So it is a little tricky because it doesn't line up perfectly, but it's just like far enough off that it was a pain in the ass. Like it was just too different, and there was no way that the word club was going to line up at all. So I knew I just had to go in and make some edits with the stamp tool so I can get the original Fight Club text off of this soapy background. I started by selecting small areas and using the content aware erase so that, I wanted to see how much of this could be done through the app without me having to do it by hand. And you can see it got some parts of it off, but it really wasn't enough. I had to keep going in and doing a mix of the content aware delete as well as the stamp and healing brush. So stamping, doing the clone stamp is really not my favorite thing to do. It's super tedious and really, really hard when you don't have enough of an image to grab from, and trying to get pieces from in between these letters is just really, really awkward, and just it was not fun at all. I also experimented with just like eyedropping the colors and kind of doing a rough airbrush over them, but there's so much texture in this original image because of all the soapy suds. It was just super hard. And then if I stamped too much, you could really start to see where it was repeating and it looked really unnatural. So I had to pay like a lot of attention to what I was doing and where I was grabbing the original like art from, so it wasn't too soapy for this part or too red for this part. I mean, it was very tedious. Yeah, I felt like sometimes I got lucky with the content aware tool and big chunks of this would just disappear, but it was definitely not perfect any of these times. So it was all just trial and error. I definitely tried the content aware everywhere that I could before anything else, before deciding to use the clone stamp, and just, pressing my luck basically. Okay, so once I had all of the soapy parts and the original Fight Club logo out of there, then it was time to start stylizing the text that I had to make it look like the original. So I made a duplicate here so I could reference it quickly, and I just shrunk it down and put it up in the corner so I could always kind of be able to look at it. So clearly the first thing to do here is kind of create this color gradation of these pinks on the top of the soap. And it's hard because it kind of looks unnatural and unrealistic to begin with. So I'm trying to match something that is kind of fake looking already, but trying to make it look as realistic as possible, but also close to the original. So I decided to hand paint in the gradient here, just so I could have some more control of where everything landed rather than using the gradient tool and just letting it wipe across like wherever it would go. And then take this, fine tune it by continuing to like eyedrop and paint different colors on it. And then use the effects like a blur effect to kind of make it a little bit more natural. Not too far though. That looks crazy. So after looking at it with just the blur, I decided that I needed to go back and actually add a little bit of noise before I did the blur, just to kind of keep with the grain of this original photo. I mean, since it is super old, like it definitely has a lot of grain. Plus they probably ran filters on this stuff because the look of the movie, it was like so like gritty and, just dusty in the way that things were back then in the early 2000s. So yeah, definitely wanted to match that noise and that blur to keep it looking soft and, similar to the original reference. I kind of kept having trouble every time that I was using my like hue and saturation or color balance or like any kind of sliders, my computer was just freaking out and I was getting all these black boxes. So I duplicated the layer here to kind of make this 3D effect, since it does, kind of raise up off of the flat part of the soap. So it kind of looks engraved, or I guess embossed or debossed. I don't know, whatever it is, it's like cut out of there. So it's raised. So I duplicated my layer and I made it a dark version of that pink so that it kind of looks shadowy. And then I took a soft brush and brushed in a little bit of detail into it so that it wasn't just like a solid color. I had a little bit of variation. So then I dropped that color and I went in and filled in these corners so that it all like kind of connected, because whenever you just duplicate a layer, it doesn't necessarily give you a 3D effect automatically. So I just kind of kept experimenting by duplicating the layers, messing with the colors, and blurring out one of the layers to give it a little bit more of like a shadowing effect. And I started playing with the layer styles. I use a lot of overlay in this design because it lets you use that blending mode in a way that like you still retain some color. I feel like overlay can get you some real natural shadows if you use it as part of a group of layers. Like if you have a dark black layer, you can use that as multiply. But I think if you have a dark black layer, you could also have a dark red layer and put that one on overlay, and it'll kind of help things look a little bit more natural. So I also used the transparency to kind of blend the shadows and the different layers that I was doing. Yeah, and you can see I got more weird black boxes, and sometimes I just had to commit to my changes just so I could get away from that, and I had to undo some of them because they just made it look weird and unnatural. I don't know why my computer was doing that. If anybody knows why Photoshop blacks out some boxes whenever you're using sliders, let me know in the comments so that way if there's like a fix or something, I can address that. So I did add a slight bevel to the edges using the effects layer for bevel and emboss, and I played around with some of the highlight modes trying to get something smooth and natural, because there's not actually a lot of that in the original reference. But I felt like it was going to make a difference on mine, just so I can get some more highlights and variations rather than just the shadows and things that I drew over it myself. So I really just wanted to make it super light and subtle, but just to give it a little bit of curve on the edges. I always play with these, these modes here for the highlights and stuff, and I never know what any of them are supposed to be doing. I just click on them until I find one that I like. I know that's super kind of dumb, but it works, whatever works. You just got to do whatever works for you to get the look that you want. Sometimes it's about visually like accepting how your work looks and not necessarily worrying about the like technical process and what's right and what's wrong or what you were taught in school. Sometimes you just got to mess around with stuff until it works. I know I've mentioned this on my channel before, but I am completely self-taught. I started learning Photoshop back in probably 1999 or early 2000. And I just learned everything by watching other people work or just figuring things out as I went. So that's kind of still how I work. And I think it works out great because it keeps me wanting to learn more and learn more of the tools and things when they release new things in Photoshop and Illustrator. Whereas a lot of people who learned it in school just kind of stick to what they were taught, and that's just what they know from then on. And I don't really like being stuck in that mindset. So I kind of was messing around here, really trying to figure out how to make this soap carving look as natural as possible. So I was playing with the curves, the levels, the hue and saturation, and all of these black boxes were driving me crazy. So eventually I just stopped trying to mess with that entirely. And pretty much where I landed looked exactly like it did when I started. Like most of the changes that I did to it were so subtle that nothing really looked that different in the end. Maybe I should have left it that gold color. No, it's horrible. Like I ended up just canceling and not committing to any of these color changes that I was doing. I mean, none of it was working out, and it was impossible to see with all of this black box flashing. I mean, I was so frustrated. So yeah, eventually I realized that it was just a stupid mock-up of a Fight Club soap, which is like the oldest graphic design trick in the book. And I decided I had done enough and it looked totally fine. The last thing that I wanted to do to the text though was get a paper texture so that I could throw a little bit of texture over that little bit of noise that we blurred out over the text in the beginning, just to make it a little bit closer to the reference. Maybe not more realistic, but just a little bit closer to the reference. So I went ahead and did this with just a simple multiply and then lowered the transparency on the paper layer. And I think it ended up looking totally fine. So then I just used the transform tool to go ahead and shape the paper layer a little bit closer to the actual text, since it is like crooked and skewed, but I think it totally followed that like shape of the grain and everything and made it look just a little bit more like the reference. Again, it's not so realistic, but you know, the reference isn't either. It was really just trying to get close to it. And the further I got into this process, the more I decided that it's just for a silly podcast where me and my friend Fabian talk about movies, and it wasn't really that big of a deal. Plus, this Fight Club style has been done so many times. I'm willing to bet that there are so many other like tutorials specifically about making the Fight Club soap. And I'm not trying to be one of those. I just thought it would be a cool walkthrough of how I made this cover art, and it just happened to look like the Fight Club soap. So I added a little bit more shadows here. I felt like throwing that like kind of glow on it made a little bit of a difference in how it stood out from the soap bar in the back. This was still just a little too harsh, and I had to adjust some settings and get it, you know, more subtle. When you're creating a 3D look like this and you have an extra shadow, you want it to just be like a transition between the top and the bottom layer. And so you really should play with the transparency, the opacity, and the, you know, if you have like a multiply or an overlay or whatever, just make sure that it's turned way down and it's as subtle as it can be. I mean, it makes a big difference when you're looking at it up close. So I decided to throw a little bit more blur on here because I really wanted it to get as close as I could to the reference, and it's pretty blurry, probably because it's like lower res, but I think it kind of makes it look more gritty and fall into the style of the graphic. So then I threw on a little bit of an inner glow or an outer glow. I can't remember which one I did here. And this video monitor is pretty small, but I threw in a glow just to, again, give it a little bit more subtle texture and feeling. But I mean, it's super, super subtle. Everything that I'm doing here at this point is like, just like nuanced things that I'm adding to it and messing around with, just trying to get it as close to, you know, the look and feel that I wanted it to be. Again, with these flashing boxes, oh, it's driving me crazy now. I'm not even working on it right now. Yeah, so here's where I was throwing in the inner glow and trying to use the pink so that it stayed subtle and not necessarily look like I was throwing a white glow on it. It's funny because when you start working in Photoshop early on, you use a lot of these effects. And then the further you get into like being a pro, you kind of stop using them just because it feels outdated. And then eventually you get to the point where you realize that they're actually useful if you put in some time and effort to make it look good and natural and stack those effects and not just make some like boring, weak shit just off of the default settings, you know? So I guess the lesson in that is to tell you that if you are opposed to using them, maybe give them another shot. Like if you're at a level where you think you have the understanding and the patience to go in and stack those effects and really play with the default things that come in Photoshop and edit them so that they're something new and fresh, I think you should give it another shot. So I'm painting in just a couple more little highlights. I think I'm just using a white brush, super soft, on its own layer that's clipped to the text, just so we can get a little bit of highlights and things in there on an overlay transparency mode or blending mode. But I think it's pretty close at this point. I think it looks really good, and it's what I was wanting it to be. And now I just need to add the text to tell you the extra information about it. And, the title's already there, so that's pretty great. And save your work. Always save your work. So now I just kind of grouped all the layers together, so that way I could just have them saved as the art and have everything in one place so I can play with the scale, move it around. I wasn't really sure exactly where I wanted the focal art to be. I mean, it is the title of the podcast, so it needs to be pretty apparent and upfront. And so it doesn't just, get lost or, fall into the background and it just looks like the soap is a graphic, but you need to be able to look at it and know that the soap is telling you the title of the podcast. So I think I'll just zoom through all of these different letter placements and attempts at moving this thing around because I feel like I did that forever. So let's just zoom through. All right, so there you go. That's where we landed. That's the cover that we're using for the new podcast. And I think, it was pretty straightforward. I mean, I spent a lot of time working on the carved soap text, but, that's the focus point of the artwork. And I think the font choice and the lettering, just like talking with like having the host names and whatever on it was very secondary to the artwork. There was a point in there when we were sliding through that, you probably saw me go to Google and search for the top podcasts of the year and their artwork, because I really wanted to see how other people's podcasts like put the host names or any of the other vital information, if it said the word podcast on the cover, because I want to make sure that our artwork doesn't look amateur or look stupid compared to something that's coming from like NPR or, iHeartRadio or like a really big time kind of podcast group or company. And I just want to like point out that that's something you should do, and you shouldn't be ashamed of like comparing what you're working on to somebody else's stuff. If you're working on album covers, if you're working on t-shirts, go to Google, go to Pinterest, search what other people are doing. I mean, everybody does it. And if anybody tells you that they don't, they're fucking lying to you. Everybody does it. You absolutely should know what other people are doing in the field, in the space that you're working in. It's a super important step. And I easily could have like cut it out and just made it seem like I figured out my text layout on my own, but I did not. And that's super important. That's a very important thing to be comfortable with and understand that other people do it. So I decided to leave that in. All right, well, that's pretty much it. I'm actually going to end this episode with a tiny little clip from the podcast so you guys can get a preview of what it's like. I won't take up too much more of your time, but if this is your first time checking out one of my videos, I would really appreciate a subscribe and possibly hit that little bell down there so you can be notified whenever I release new videos. I don't normally do stuff like this. I usually do tutorials and how-tos and really kind of teach while I design. Not a lot of voiceovers, so this is kind of different. So check out the rest of my channel. Find some of the other videos. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I'll catch you on the next one. And then when they bring him in, the way he collapses on the floor when he goes inside the house, I have 100% done that myself. Absolutely.
Oh my God.
Like one time I did that. I was when I was living in San Diego, I got so drunk. I came home and it was like raining and stuff. I was wearing boots and I couldn't get my boots untied, and I just collapsed in the front, like the entrance of my house. And I was like trying to get my boots off, and I got them unlaced a little bit, but the knot just got tighter, and I had to get my pocket knife and cut my boot laces off.
You're fighting for your life at that point, dude.